Muted.
Members call on digital equity. My name is Deb Sosha, and I'm the Executive Director of Next Century Cities. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, having spent time as the Executive Director of the digital inclusion effort in Boston called Tech Goes Home, a project that now is also running in Chattanooga, and I saw
Muted.
she is on the call, and she may have something to add as well because she's running that project in Chattanooga. A couple of quick housekeeping details. We ask everyone to remain muted. We will automatically mute folks, but we really do want to reduce the impact of ambient noise. If you have questions, and we really hope you will, please type them in the chat box located on the bottom right hand of your control panel screen, and we will be sure to address them during the call. You can send them either to organizers or to everyone. It's up to you. The webinar will be recorded, and it's going to be shared on our resource page should you want to refer back to it or share it with others. One other reminder quickly, please remember to have your city apply for the Benton Next Generation Engagement Award found on the awards page of our website. Selected cities will get $30,000 in technical assistance, and the application is due June 15th. I hope you'll check it out. So let's get right to it. Chris Mitchell will be moderating the conversation. I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce our all-star panelists today.
Great. And Deb, did you just want to say a word about why digital inclusion is important to Next Century Cities before we do the introduction?
Sure. So at Next Century Cities, we work with 140 cities, as you probably know, and that includes some. 1 second. Sorry, we got feedback. 1 second. 1 second. Okay. So. Sorry, we had two computers going and we got feedback there. So all of our citizens really need the opportunity to be online for all the reasons we know, for education, for public safety, for economic development, for all of the ways in which we all spend our lives online and succeed because of that. And so we really do want to be able to encourage our cities and support our cities as they make the effort to ensure that everyone is online. And you know, the opportunity to really be able to participate as citizens in a city through participatory democracy and you know, democratic decision making is something we should all aspire to see happening. It's only helpful to our cities and our city leaders when that occurs. And so we do deeply care about the opportunity to help our cities be successful in this area.
Terrific. I'd like to just add briefly that as someone who was ranting a little bit earlier, or joking about ranting about the internet being capitalized, one of the reasons I think it's important is because the internet connects all networks. It's something unique that cannot be duplicated. And there's something perverse about connecting effectively, being able to connect all devices to the internet, but not having all humans having access to that. And I think it's really important that we do everything we can to make sure that people can take full advantage of this incredible thing that we've created. And so that's one of my personal motivations. But I'm going to introduce folks. We're going to have a very discussion-oriented approach in which we're going to keep comments short. We're going to have many people. We're going to have each of our panelists making many comments. There's going to be lots of opportunities for questions. In fact, if you want to start submitting questions now, you should feel free to. And we'll work them in as we are able to. You can send them to everyone, or you can send them to the organizers if you would prefer, and we'll get to them as we are able to work them into the discussion. So I'm going to start by introducing people and ask them a quick question so you get to hear their voice and learn a little bit about them. And we're going to start with Susan Corvid, the CEO of Axiom Technology. Susan, I wanted to ask you, what is Axiom? And tell us a little bit about why digital inclusion is important to you.
Well, thanks, Chris, and nice to meet everybody through a webinar this afternoon. Thanks, Deb, for organizing it. So my name is Susan Corvid. I'm the CEO of Axiom Technologies. We are located in Washington County, Maine, so we're in the most northeast part of the United States. And we also have a nonprofit organization called the Axiom Education and Training Center. And under that nonprofit, we provide digital literacy throughout Washington County and the state of Maine. So digital inclusion is really important for us because as a last mile broadband provider, the a company that goes in and provides internet to communities that are often left behind. And digital inclusion is very important as we just talk to communities and municipalities about why they need to take charge of their broadband plans. In digital inclusion, we're including affordable broadband, affordable internet, affordable equipment, digital literacy classes, and public computer access. So as municipalities begin to form plans and decide whether they're going to spend money, having buy-in to those to the internet and why it's important really points to digital inclusion. So we promote that really on the front end as we're working with communities throughout Maine.
Wonderful. We're going to move next to David Keys, the Community Technology Program Director in Seattle. David, I wanted to ask you what you do in Seattle, tell folks what you're up to, and to give us a short introduction to what Seattle is doing on digital inclusion, please.
Great, thanks. Glad to be here with everybody. Thanks for everyone for joining in. So I'm in the IT department at the City of Seattle and I run the Community Technology or Digital Equity program. And in context, then the city has an overall broadband strategy that's working on lowering barriers to competition, increasing infrastructure, and making internet access high speed and affordable for everyone. We kind of have a long-standing and a high commitment to broadband adoption or digital inclusion then as part of that. And I think in addition to what Susan said, I think the one other mention is, certainly as a city, one of those really strong interests for us is making sure that people have the capacity for jobs and to use city services as well. So we can talk a little bit more about kind of the framing, but we also we released this last year in March a new digital equity plan that basically has 17 strategies in 3 primary areas of access, connectivity, and skills development. And then we've also looked at electronic civic engagement and capacity building. And then kind of in short, we have, yeah, go ahead.
No, please continue.
So just kind of in short, then a couple elements of the programs that we have working on is, in general, providing some public Wi-Fi and looking at a broader Wi-Fi strategy. We run public internet stations or kiosks in some of these mini city halls that we have and in the Parks and Rec community centers. We've been working closely with Public Housing Authority and are part of the Federal Connect Home program. And then we're also working on digital literacy and working with ISPs on the low-income internet programs as well as community groups. And lastly, we, as part of our cable franchise, negotiated for free internet connections for nonprofit organizations. So we also provide those.
Wonderful. And Deb noted in the chat room that you deserve congratulations for receiving the Benton Digital Inclusion Award, which was from the organization EIA. So congratulations for that. And I believe we're going to be sending out an email to folks after the call with more resources, and within that I hope we'll certainly include a link to learn much more about Seattle's programs. We're going to move on to Ann Schwiger, who is the Broadband and Digital Equity Advocate for Boston. Ann, why is it important to make sure that everyone has access to the full internet rather than just a baseline speed or like a series of a few websites? And you should certainly start by just letting people know what your position does, but then please flow into the question.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks so much to the whole Next Century Cities team for the opportunity to be here today. So as Chris said, my name is Ann Schwiger. I work for the City of Boston as what's called Broadband and Digital Equity Advocate. And I'm housed within the Department of Innovation and Technology. So my job was created to address two big problems. One is that in Boston, we don't really have a competitive, healthy broadband marketplace. About 90% of constituents have a single option for their broadband and cable provider. In a city of 667,000 people, that's just over 600,000 people who have a single option. Another big challenge we face, and that I'm charged with helping us to address, is the fact that over 1 in 5 Bostonians have not adopted broadband in the home. We estimate that to be about 140,000 people, which transitions nicely into the question that Chris poses. Why is it important that all Bostonians not only be connected to the internet, but connected to it in a way that allows them to fully engage with everything that the internet has to offer? Basically, broadband and digital equity are foundational to a lot of the things that Boston as a city has highly prioritized. This administration cares very deeply about equity in all manner of public life. We're working very hard on affordable housing, working very hard on workforce, ensuring that all constituents have not just access to public libraries and on smartphones, but full access to true broadband in their home is absolutely critical to ensuring that all of the other goals that we have in place can be actualized. So when we think about, I'd like us all to perhaps pause for a second to think about what it looks like when 140,000 people are relying on something other than broadband in the home to carry out, to do homework, to apply to college, to find housing, to look for jobs, to start a business. We start to, I think, get a glimpse into why it is so important that everyone have, high-speed internet in the home that is not a data-capped, rationed internet, but that allows them to do what they need to do to advance their life in the direction they'd like it to go.
Wonderful. We're going to introduce our final speaker now, Pat Millen, who is the founder and president of E2D, which I'm guessing was not named out of one of the lesser-known characters in the Star Wars universe. But Pat, I'd like you to tell me a little bit about what your organization is and what motivated you to start it.
Yeah, thank you. It's again, with everyone else, it's a tremendous honor to be on this call, particularly with people who have accomplished so much over such a long time. E2D stands for Eliminate the Digital Divide, and we've not been around for that long. We basically were founded by a 12-year-old girl about 3.5 years ago, and that girl happens to be my daughter, who came home from middle school one day and said, "Dad, I don't get it. Every assignment we get at school presumes that you have a computer at home to be able to do the work, and I know that's not true at my school, and that's unfair. What are we going to do about it?" And it's that question, what are we going to do about it, which launched E2D. What we did about it, to not bury the lead, is we went to the mayor of the town that we live in, which is Davidson, North Carolina, and we said, "Mayor, we live in a relatively affluent suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, but we know that there are pockets of poverty. It doesn't seem to be that much of a stretch in a community like this that if there are people that are behind the digital divide, that we ought to be able to find solutions." And solutions to us meant devices and connectivity and digital literacy training so that we could help them use their computers in the most relevant ways to their lives and obviously to the students. And so not even 3 years ago, we went to a single elementary school and we distributed 54 laptops and digital solutions to 54 families. And since then, we realized that hiding in plain sight in the Charlotte community are thousands and thousands of laptop computers. And more often we're seeing better and more competitive pricing for low-income families for internet options. and digital training, digital literacy training is that moving feast that we've got a lot of people in Charlotte working on it, and we're jumped in on it as well. And so over the course of not quite 3 years, we've been able to provide solutions for 1,200 families within the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. We have another 24 to 25,000 families that we believe need this access in order for us to be able to declare our school system to be free of a digital divide, and that's what we're all here for.
Excellent. Well, now we've met each of our panelists. We're going to start talking about a number of, we're going to start discussing a number of the subjects relating to this. There's many different ways we can go. We have more questions than we can cover in the entire time. And Deb will be jumping in from time to time to supplement our discussions. The place I wanted to start, though, I think, and I'd like to start by picking on David, because I know Seattle's done a lot of work to try to understand this, is to ask who is not online, and do we have a sense of why they're not online? Before anyone worries a little too much, we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about solutions, and suspect that a lot of you have some of this, but we wanted to make sure we just touch on a couple of key points as to who's not online. So, David, do you have a sense in Seattle of who's not online?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, I think, to look at it in detail too. So I mean, certainly we know in general there are fewer people. So I mean, we've been doing a local broadband or technology access and adoption study that looks at folks that are online, what barriers are to that, their interest in how they prefer to get alerts and notices from the city, and also we use it as part of our cable assessment. So Ann mentioned a couple things. I mean, we know generally from a couple of years ago there's about 93,000 residents in Seattle that don't have any internet at home. I think as you parse that out, though, so certainly in what we've seen in some of the national studies and the great data from Pew and the census data is there's certainly lower connectivity for those who are low income, low education, disabled seniors. And then as you look at different ethnic communities, there's some differences there too. And I think one of the things that we found that's really striking is that I think two things. One is that while there are the appearance of, you know, in data showing more people have connectivity, the challenge for those with less connectivity, either no connectivity or limited connectivity, I think is growing greater. So they sort of the economic and opportunity and participation opportunity is greater, and sometimes that's hidden. And so just as a for instance, you know, that's the family that runs out of data and drives to the library on a Sunday night to help their kid do their homework that we've seen, or has to rely on just a smartphone to fill out a long job application. So, so it begins to be subtleties in that. And then we've also seen things like in our data, we know that about a quarter of residents were not comfortable opening email attachments. So as we look at the cities providing information to residents, that becomes information, both a barrier and information we need to use in our strategies for delivering city services. And then, you know, with the question, I think there's an interesting kind of question about home internet, or, you know, fixed internet versus mobile internet, which we could probably spend a whole nother hour on. But, you know, we do see, particularly like for the disabled community that needs to, for a blind person that needs to navigate, not having, you know, a smartphone with data puts them at a really big disadvantage when they're trying to travel around town. And then just the other thing I'll just mention too, that I think as you look at some of the data and some of the national data, it doesn't always get at limited English-speaking communities. So that's a piece to sort of parse out more. We do some focus groups with limited English speakers, but so we know that there's a kind of a greater disadvantage that's not always recorded for some of the immigrant refugee community, and some differences in patterns among some of the different cultural groups in use of the internet and digital skill level.
Excellent. That's a lot of information, giving us a sense of these different populations, and that it's clearly not just a cross section. This is the jump-in round. So let me just see if Susan, Ann, Pat, Deb, if anyone wants to add on to that. Well, let me suggest that we then talk about whether or not there's a problem of relevance versus cost for the populations that are not online, and I'm curious in particular, Pat, did you get a sense that in your work in Davidson that there was an issue of a greater problem with the cost of access, or was it a question of people not understanding that it was something that would benefit their households?
I actually think it was probably a little bit of a combination of those two things. I think there was very likely a lack of appreciation of how to best access these sorts of solutions. So I think to a lot of the families in our community that were not, that were behind the digital divide, I think they were sitting there going, okay, by the time we pay for food, shelter, healthcare, clothing, etc., that unfortunately having access to a computer and access to the internet would be a distant fifth or sixth because it's something that's so far out of reach for us. So I think a lot of what we have found in the last few years is, particularly with solutions that we've helped provide in terms of donating refurbished computers and actually really working our municipal cable company over to come up with what we consider to be a very fair rate for these families. Over time, I think we've come up with solutions that are manageable, and that these families over time have come to see that their neighbors are online, and what's this all about, and why can't we get online too?
And Susan, I'm curious if you have an experience with different types of communities across Maine, Maine having everything from, cities like Portland, which are more dense, to smaller, more rural areas. What's your sense of the relevance versus cost issue?
Well, we have about 2% of the state that have zero access to broadband. So, getting that, that is an absolute issue. If they don't have access to broadband, then they're obviously not going to use it. About 75% broadband adoption rate across the state of Maine, and it's for all of the things that we've talked about. Affordable broadband, whether they have computers at home or any device at home. Typically, through the digital literacy classes that we have held, there's typically some type of a the carrot that gets dangled in front of the user. They've received an iPad for Christmas. They have a Roku. They have a new data phone, and they need to learn how to use it. And that will bring them to the classes. And then once they're in the classes, then they typically will sign up for more. So, and then the other piece of that is, where are those classes? So part of the success of our program is making sure that the classes are brought to the people. So the classes are held throughout Washington County, and as we work in other areas in Maine, through many locations. Time, distance, and travel is a barrier for educational attainment in rural areas, and so having those classes accessible to our residents is really important.
This is Deb. I have to say, I think that for a lot of folks, that price is such a huge factor that somehow relevance becomes irrelevant, if that makes sense. So we never get to the conversation about relevance because price is such a huge leap for families. I really believe that in circumstances where we can provide a decent quality service, as Anne said, not something different for the folks who are poor over here, but a decent quality service for a price that people can afford, I think it would impact adoption significantly, and then we could get to the issue of relevance. This becomes the prerequisite, in my mind, to really a much more fully accessible opportunities for low-income families.
And this seems right up your right up your alley. That's the right word. Please jump in.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I think it's pretty challenging to disentangle affordability, like a cost and relevancy. And we've seen through like the success of programs like Tech Goes Home here in Boston and now replicated in other cities like Chattanooga, that it is, as that says, very important to address both through digital skills training and through supporting people and finding affordable, low-cost offerings. I think it's also important to note that people demonstrate that they believe the internet to be very relevant to their life by showing up in places like the public library to use internet in the public computing areas. We've seen in the case of like New York City and Seattle and Kansas City hotspot lending programs through their libraries that people, check these out. There are, like 5 people at a time in some cases waiting, in line to check these out next. So I think that it's important for us to see that many people who can't afford broadband in the home are using it in other places and would use it in the home if they could afford it.
And Todd here, it's worth noting that sometimes we see social science research that suggests that low-income families report, oh, that's not, maybe the internet's not relevant to me, so maybe we should concentrate policymaking and programming elsewhere. But I think Anne attests to a really key point here, which is there's stated relevance and then there's observed relevance. And for many low-income households, there's a stigma attached to telling a pollster or an interviewer, I'm too poor for the internet. I can't afford it. And it's easier just to say the more socially acceptable response, oh, that's just not for me. And so Anne's absolutely right that the issues of relevance and price are intimately entangled and not easily not easily dealt with separately.
One thing I would add, I'm sorry, one thing I would add is the first time I heard about the question of relevancy as it related to this was when Google Fiber made their first announcement in Charlotte about 1.5 years ago. And I walked up to Erica Swanson at the end and I said, is there anyone under the age of 18 that questions the relevance of what a laptop computer and digital broadband will mean in their life? And she said, no, relevance is not an issue for students. It's very relevant, and they know it, and they know that by not having it, they're at a massive disadvantage.
Thank you, Pat. And before that was Todd O'Boyle, the Deputy Director of Next Century Cities, who did not introduce the beginning, but thank you very much for jumping in. So I want to turn to what local governments can do, and I'd like to be very specific here with any, with any really concrete kinds of things, ideally things that already have been done. And I'll leave it open for anyone to jump in with what we can do at the local level.
This is David. I'd like to do a quick jump in here. I think for us, one of the projects or approaches that we've done is kind of two things. One is sort of mapping where the community capacity is and how do we develop that, and making some investments around that. So for instance, I think, identifying where your access points are in addition, so the libraries are certainly a great one, but looking beyond that in terms of where other computers are, whether it's boys and girls clubs, whether it's schools that can be open after hours, whether it's a law library or other kinds of locations, and doing some mapping of that, because that also helps us place resources. And the other piece, I think, this access relevancy question, as Susan mentioned earlier, the importance of kind of having trusted locations, comfortable locations, is really critical. So we partner a lot with sort of what we see as sort of our trusted information and teaching ambassadors in community organizations. So that may be cultural groups like the Ethiopian Community Center, or youth groups, or public housing complexes and nonprofits. And so we established, as a, for instance, a technology matching fund grant program that gives grants to community-based projects for skills and access. And we also see them as really critical outreach points for the low-income internet programs. And they provide information back to us about challenges there too. So I think the relevancy question is also one of trust and comfort in using information. And so having the sort of information ambassadors is kind of a really critical investment for communities to make.
So we have mapping the sort of community anchor locations where people can get public access, and working with perhaps like cultural ambassadors, communities that are not the dominant community, not the dominant ethnic group. And let's just leave it open for other people to sort of pipe in really good local government approaches.
And this is Deb, and oh, sorry.
No.
Go ahead, Deb, and I think it's the end next to her.
Yeah, I just was going to say that, I think that the issue of trust is huge, and I think a really good best practice from some of the good projects around the country is the idea of getting into the neighborhood and working locally in neighborhood organizations that are already existing, like libraries and schools and faith-based organizations, and leveraging that sense of trust. And this is a quote I don't know who said first, so I don't claim to own it, but progress happens at the speed of trust is a really good statement about how this works. Folks need to feel that this is a trusted resource when they participate, because this is a little bit scary for some folks. So I think cities can work in collaboration. I think the idea of what David did in Seattle with the grants is awesome. I know that Austin has actually followed suit and is doing something similar. I think that's a really nice way to encourage and support local organizations to assist.
Was that you that was trying to say something, Ann?
Yes, it was. So we've seen here in Boston that one of the challenges that programs like Tech Goes Home and just, the city in general experiences in helping people who have not subscribed to broadband in the home, subscribe to broadband in the home, is that there are not a lot of options. And I think that underscores the importance of cities really pursuing competition. Right now, like the only affordable wireline broadband offering is something called Internet Essentials, and there are certainly some real benefits to this program. However, if you are not a household that has school-age children who qualify for free or reduced lunch, or you have a child in Head Start, or if you're not a senior citizen, there's quite literally no affordable broadband option for you. And I would also note that while Comcast Internet Essentials is an increasingly well-run program, and I say that very honestly, they are doing an increasingly better job. It is not true broadband. So it's 10 megabits down, while the FCC designs true broadband to be 25 megabits down. So yeah, competition and choice is also very critical in the digital inclusion space.
Pat, can I ask you to just talk a little bit? You made a comment, and you are one of the towns that has a municipally owned network. It's a cable network that the city had bought from Adelphia out of bankruptcy. And you said that you had really pushed them to create a program that would help connect low-income folks. Can you just tell us a little bit about what went into that, and maybe any lessons you learned from that effort?
Well, I had tremendous leverage because I'm one of the owners. As a citizen, since we're going to be, yeah, we'll be paying off this bond for the rest of our lives until the rapture. But all kidding aside, that did give us some leverage where we were able to go to that company and say, listen, we as a community elected to purchase this as a public utility, as well as something ultimately where the town of Davidson would be able to control the ability to distribute this sort of product. At the time, we had no idea what the threshold should be in terms of what would be fair. So we went to them and said, listen, if we're dealing exclusively with low-income families as defined by SNAP and other things, what do you think is fair? And they came back and said, how about $19.99 a month? And we said, how about $9.99 a month? And we ultimately settled on $13.99 a month. And the good news is that there are a lot of families. I mean, through our organization, we probably pay 1,000 cable bills a month working with these families to help through that process. The slight downside on that is it's all wired solutions, and a lot of these families move. And so just as soon as we might find the solution for them, they may end up having to pick up and move to wherever the next crop is that needs to be harvested. So it's a very good solution. The cable company in our town, frankly, has sort of been under assault from the moment it was purchased by the town, and so this was a very, very easy way for them to show some community support. And I think, you know, the bottom line is they're hoping that a lot of these families are going to be upwardly mobile and buying cable packages from them someday, but that was never something that was stated up front.
And Susan, we haven't heard from you recently. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for local government action.
I actually do. So Axiom is involved in the Connect Maine planning grants, broadband planning grants. They're awarded to 4 communities throughout the state. And part of our initial discussions with the communities are to start getting them thinking about what their community technology plan is. For many communities or many municipalities, they have comprehensive plans that are part of their working document. And many of them are old, and technology was not initially put into those plans. So it's starting to get the communities thinking about what's their plan in the long term. 10 years out, what do they see? What do they want their community to look like with technology? If their plan is to put fiber to every home, how are they going to get there? What's the path to get there? So the planning grants are going to be really interesting because we'll be meeting with community groups, municipal leaders, business leaders, and helping them figure out what they need. The education piece is a big part of it. Why is this important? How are we going to get buy-in from your communities if they're going to figure out the funding to finance building network throughout their communities? So we think that the communities need to start thinking really proactively of what is their plan going to be, and really digging in on that.
And I'm curious if you started to see any lessons from any of the communities that have already started making those sorts of plans.
They are they're taking out their comprehensive plans and they're dusting them off, and they're looking at whether there has been any mention of broadband in it, and for most there have not, and beginning to add that into their comprehensive plans moving forward. So it's been great discussion with them. It's something that, the technology has evolved around them. So, and in many municipalities you have leaders that come and go, elected in and out. So it may be the first time that they're really looking at a technology plan for their community and engaging their residents in the process.
I would like to come back to the Connect Home type programs, the often voluntary Comcast Essentials kind of thing, and talk a little bit more about them specifically. Does anyone have any immediate reaction? Oh, sorry, please, David.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to jump in on picking up on Susan for just one sec. I think there's a real value to local communities creating this set of digital inclusion goals. So Susan mentioned the the comprehensive plans, and that's one area. I think just having some framework to say that these are our goals has helped us drive some benefits towards digital inclusion. So that's been some of the underpinning, I think, for us to be able to direct funds or cable settlement funds where there's been violations in enforcement, or in some areas look at, can you direct telecom revenue or city surplus computers to digital inclusion programs. So, and the other piece that's come up in our comprehensive plan is looking generally at equitable development. So looking at the kind of mix of broadband and digital literacy programs in underserved areas, or areas that are kind of slated for assistance and development in our community. So I guess I just want to reemphasize that importance of having the sort of overarching goals and framework in your city kind of comp plan, mission, work plans, because it also involves other departments as well. So it might involve human services, economic development as well, helping to partner in working on digital inclusion.
Well, that's actually, we'll come back to the Connect Home type things, but I wanted to actually ask Anne about that in terms of cross-departmental kind of efforts. You know, in larger cities, I think especially we have silos, but it even happens in smaller cities. But, you know, what can cities do to, or what's best practices, and what are the benefits of reaching across the silos? And Anne, before you answer that, let me just remind people, please submit a question. If you have any questions, don't forget you can do that using the chat function. Anne, let you answer the question now.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So I think that before I jump right into that, I should say, and this is a question that Deb poses a lot, is like, how important is elected officials' buy-in on digital equity? And I would say it's very important, and it's the reason why we have had such success in Boston in collaborating across departments. So most recently, we are taking a close look at some of the more foundational infrastructural pieces of the puzzle that we think that ultimately will contribute to Boston being a place where more choice and competition can happen, which we believe will result in lower prices for higher speed options that more Bostonians can afford. So I think that when we think about digital inclusion, it, you know, the first players we think about, right, at least think about tend to be schools, libraries, the offices that run community centers, offices of that sort. The more infrastructural collaborators tend to be like public works, the inspectional services department, the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So the people who are trying to help us figure out, okay, well, we could have, I mean, for example, right now in Boston, we have, as of today, I think 3 wireline providers for broadband, but they don't have incredibly even coverage across the city. So that doesn't actually do anything for a low-income person who needs a low-cost offering from someone other than the one that they have access to. So what can we do at the level of like the physical building to ensure that multiple providers have access to serve constituents? What are the things that we can do in our building codes to make sure that as we're building new properties and approving remodels, that the inside of buildings can accommodate, can be as future-proof as, you know, the fiber that we would like to see built all around the city. Yeah, so there's, and I like to say that in most of the things I do, there are no fewer than 2 departments involved. And I think if you find yourself working solo a lot in this space, it's probably time to reach out and make a whole bunch of friends across City Hall.
Yes. There's an opportunity from Housing and Urban Development, the federal agency, HUD, which is they're taking comments on a new rule which would require certain building codes and things like that. Deb, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? And if you are, you're currently muted, just so you know. There we go.
So yes, I think that the idea that HUD could have an expectation that all new buildings and all other buildings that are having a big overhaul would actually have to make them ready for a provider I think that's really incredibly helpful. I think all of those opportunities that heighten the awareness and help to push this a little further down the road all together come up with a plan that can help us move forward. I wish, quite frankly, there were more money behind it. But I think that's, it's moving in the right direction.
I'd like to, there's a link in the chat box, courtesy of David, with the HUD rules, and if you're not able to access it, we will include that in the email of resources. Thank you, David. Let me be a little bit provocative. I feel like what I hear from Anne is, in her comments, is that even if we have effective programs on the order of Comcast Essentials, and even if we have good access at our community anchor institutions, that we still need to go further. And I'm just curious if that's the expectation of others, if we will need to have additional programs. Anne in Boston, they're focused on competition to try and solve this problem to a greater extent. I'm curious if others feel like an effective Connect Home kind of a program from the existing dominant providers is sufficient. Why or why not?
This is Anne. I'd like to quickly before others jump in offer why we believe that what is already in place amounts to a lot of partial fixes, but not an outright win. So we calculated that every year Tech Goes Home works with about 3,500 participants. And we know that if we hit it out of the park on Connect Home and connected all 58,000 residents who live in a Boston Housing Authority community, we would still be missing about 78,000 people who would not yet be connected to broadband in the home. So that's why we believe we need to go a lot further.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for not worrying too much when I said I'd be provocative and used your name. But I'm curious how other people react.
Yeah, this is David. I'll jump in. Yeah, I think Connect Home and these initiatives are great. I mean, where we can align and get both federal agencies as well as state and local. I mean, the HUD Connect Home program, while it's raised some resources, did not come with any funding, and so it's great to do. I think it strengthens some partnerships as we should be doing anyways. The challenge is particularly for those folks on the front lines that are helping people with skills or with getting connectivity. They're professionals, and we need to be supporting them. I mean, I see kind of our city role as an enabler and a funder at times, and kind of a steward. And so, frankly, what we're seeing from the private companies is not filling the gap, and we need to do that someplace. We also need to let people know what it costs for whether it's the library or a community organization or the city to actually run the programs to provide the teaching. You can do a fair amount with volunteers, but if we want quality results, we need to support quality programs, and that will take more investment.
This is Deb, and the thing I'd say, one of the things I tell cities that ask me about helping them with this dilemma of getting people online is that you'll hear that there are lots of fast, easy, and cheap projects out there to solve this problem, and none of them work, right? So this is a complex problem, very wrapped up in the complexities of poverty as well. And we aren't going to solve this, as David said, without quality programs, and quality programs don't happen without funding. And so how do we, when we talk about who's responsible for this, I think we as citizens own it. I think nonprofits own it. I think anchor institutions own it. I think city officials own it. I think the incumbents are part of the solution. I just don't think we can resolve this without multiple players at the table. And as Anne said, and David as well, reaching out to other, not just city organizations, city folks, but other resources within the community and really trying to get the philanthropic organizations on board as well would be a great step forward in beginning to reach the goal of having everyone online. You know, I think Davidson has done an incredible job of doing that. They have 12,000 citizens. They have their own ability to provide low-cost plan, so they have certain advantages, but it should be the goal of every one of our cities, and I believe it is, to really work toward that ubiquity of access.
So Deb, if I could just touch there, less about Davidson and more about Charlotte. Charlotte has a sort of a non-executive mayor government, and so the mayor does not dictate quite the way maybe Mayor Menino did back in the day, Deb, where funds are going to come from. Charlotte has grown in its digital inclusion work by virtue of a group called Digital Charlotte that was convened by the city but was essentially funded by the Knight Foundation, and it's an organization that has about 20 people on a steering committee that touch the issues on a daily basis, and probably another 100 beyond that who are stakeholders at the community level. And I think that's been sort of the success of Charlotte's progress towards digital solutions, is that we have a very broad-based group that is looking at this very, very carefully, and where possible without silos, you know, emerging, at least without some acknowledgement. I think where we maybe are somewhat limited is the fact that the government itself, the county and the city government, really are not in a position to do much to fund us at this point. And so we are going out and trying to really work down our telecoms and people who have the most to gain by bringing a whole new generation online. And so, once again, the greatest thing about Charlotte is our digital inclusion, digital Charlotte work, but one of our greatest limitations is the fact that the city and county government often have to, they sit back and watch us do the work as opposed to participate more actively in the solution and as part of the funding solution, if not through the tax base, helping us to access the philanthropic community in more and better creative ways.
And Susan, one of the things that I've seen that states often are willing to talk about how important this is, but not as willing to put money into it. Now, Maine has put some money into it. There's been discussions about putting even more money into broadband. So, you know, I'm curious, as someone who's from one of those states, you know, do you have a sense of, aside from what you've already mentioned with the Connect Me Authority, what else might states be doing?
Well, in Maine, in our general budget, our state budget, there is no line item for broadband expansion. So we've seen a movement going on around with our legislators over the last year or two on bills that have come before the legislators for increasing broadband in rural areas, doing planning grants. No money yet, or just a little bit just as a placeholder. But that's a changing conversation that, you know, I've been doing this for almost 12 years. That's a big change in conversation amongst the legislators, and that is the result of their constituents putting pressure on them and saying, you know, we need broadband, or we need more broadband. So, you know, I think that the legislators can play a good role if they're, you know, as broadband advocates, inform and teaching them, because they're still learning too. So I'd say that's a real important step in getting states to really take a hard look at what are they doing to increase broadband infrastructure and broadband adoption through their state, and what's their plan. Just like in the municipal level, what is the state's plan for moving forward? Some states are taking that role, some are a little bit more advanced than others, but it's an important issue for all of us.
Great. We were going to quickly just change topics to civic engagement and what cities can do to enhance online opportunities and services. David, you wanted to touch on this. It's a question from Rick that David wanted to touch on. I do want to just save a minute after that to talk briefly about Lifeline then. So please go ahead, David.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the question, Rick. Because I think this there's a lot that's going on about online civic engagement and development of services, and I would say kind of two things. You know, one is part of what we've done is kind of the continual sort of look at which tools to use, and I think as you're doing the web or online services planning, the important thing is to pick something and that you can kind of stick with it and develop in more detail to ensure that people use it. We just recently kind of used the participatory budget tool. There's sort of more work going on. There's some really interesting work going around text conversations too. Interestingly, like DC is also enabling people to text in for information about their low-income internet programs. I think one other kind of piece that we're starting to see is we use some of our adoption data to inform other departments about their outreach strategies for online services. And the opportunity, I think, is to fold in, if you fold in a digital inclusion lens into the planning for online services and civic engagement, then you sort of naturally look at outreach to some of those trusted ambassadors, and kind of from the front end could potentially start to build in some of the costs around, if it's health information, or we've done some things where some of our utility environmental reduction programs from public utilities have done programs where they had students do environmental media projects that supported digital inclusion efforts in our computer labs. So I think the important kind of thing is sort of fold in that lens at the front end for the outreach and participation, and there's a great linkage, I think, between some of the broadband adoption and online services and civic engagement.
Thank you. I want to just mention that one thing we didn't spend a lot of time on was Lifeline. Lifeline has been reformed. It's a federal government program to get subsidies in the hands of low-income either individuals or households to take $10 off of their telecom bill effectively. That program remains a bit controversial among some, and Congress may be debating it. So if this is something that's important to you, you may want to make sure that you're letting your Congress folks know your opinions on the program and the expansion of it to broadband access, whether or not it should be capped and other things. I have no doubt that we are going to come back and talk about some of these more specifics. This is a very broad call. There's a lot of other things we can touch on. And I want to give Deb just the last minute that we have to make any final points to people. Deb,
Of course, I have to unmute me. So,
I should have given you a warning. Please, go ahead.
Unfortunately, in the background here, we've had a little bit of noise in my office today, so I've been trying to keep myself on mute. So I want to thank you all for joining the call. These are amazing people that join us. And Chris, you're right. There's a lot more to this that we need to think about and talk about and work on. I would encourage people to reach out to Next Century Cities if you have questions or concerns about digital inclusion projects or programs in your community. I am happy to both assist and make connections with other people, including the folks who are on this call today, so that you can get additional resources and support. It's really a tough problem to solve, but one that I feel we must. So it was a really robust conversation. I hope you found it as helpful as I did. And again, thanks to Chris and Ann and Pat and David and Susan for sharing your wisdom today.
And Todd.
And Todd.
All right, thank you, everyone. We'll release you back to your work days. Please do reach out to us whenever you can, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.